I'll let Jennifer introduce you to the panelists, and I will introduce you to Jennifer. Jennifer is part of our very newest cohort of Trudeau Fellows, 2013 cohort. She's the Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability at the Department of the Environment at the University of Waterloo. And thank you very much for organizing this panel, Jennifer. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And it's a great pleasure to be here today to moderate this panel with two very esteemed panelists who will answer questions and discuss with us issues related to the environment. And as I said, I'm delighted to be here because both of these panelists, I would say, they've played a big role in my own, personally in my own evolution as a scholar in the area of environmental studies. And I would like to say a few brief words of introduction of both of them before getting into the questions and the format for this session. So first I'd like to introduce Professor Bill Rees. He is a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia and was a professor for many years in the School of Community and Regional Planning. And Professor Rees is perhaps best known for his work in developing and popularizing the concept of the ecological footprint. And this concept is a very unique way of looking at the way in which our own individual consumption decisions affect the environment, and thinking not just in terms of environmental impact in that kind of abstract sense, but actually grounds it to the ground and thinks about the landmass that's required to produce the resources that we consume on a daily basis. And this concept has been widely popularized, and I always ask my students every year when I have a new class, how many have heard of this concept, and everybody raises their hand. And this is a great popular education tool. But beyond that, Bill Rees has also published very widely on areas ranging all the way from human ecological systems to population issues and even into the human psychology of consumption. And so he's got a very interesting and wide-ranging set of skills, and my actual introduction to him was through ecological economics. And when I was a young professor back in the 90s and had the privilege to welcome him to my university at that time to give a talk to our group in a seminar series on ecological economics. And Bill Rees is very renowned around the world. He has many awards under his belt, the most recent being the Blue Planet Prize, which is the equivalent of an environmental Nobel Prize. And he also is a widely sought-after public speaker, and as Jennifer mentioned, he is a Trudeau Fellow from 2007, and always a Trudeau Fellow, and we're very pleased to have him here today to share his views on these questions. And secondly, I'd like to introduce Art Hanson. He is Chief Advisor and member of the China Council for International Cooperation on Sustainable Development. And he's got a lot of experience working and advising on sustainable development issues, particularly in Asia, but also in Canada. He actually started his career as a professor at Dalhousie and built a School of Environmental Studies, and from that went on to become one of the first presidents and CEOs of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a Winnipeg-based public policy think tank around environmental issues. And as I said at the beginning, both of these individuals have been very influential for me. Art was the head of IISD at the time this organization was getting off the ground. That was also all of the publications coming out of that institute at that time, again, were very influential in my own work and got me very interested in relationship between the global economy and the environment. And that was, IISD was really taking the lead in publications at that time. And I also would like to say that Art is a Trudeau mentor from 2006. And so we're very glad. And I also wanted to say about both of these gentlemen here today are actually, I find this very interesting, they're trained as ecologists. They're coming from the field of science, yet both have made enormous impact in public policy around environmental issues, not just in Canada, but around the world. And so I'm very grateful that you both are able to participate in this session today. I wanted to welcome you. And just to say it's an appropriate time. This is a great time, even today, as we speak, to be talking about environmental issues because the UN Climate Summit is wrapping up at this time in Warsaw, in Poland. And the summit itself was held in the wake of the typhoon in the Philippines, and it's a time when many people are connecting the dots in a much more serious way about these kind of extreme weather events and their potential connection to climate change. Yet at the same time, in these international fora where we're discussing what to do about these kinds of issues, the discussions are very political and they're very fraught, as we heard about in the previous talk. And so this is the backdrop in which we'll be asking these questions. And I just want to say a bit about the structure of this session. There are two huge topics with a couple of questions associated to them, which were circulated to both Bill and Art ahead of time. And what I'll do is start with the first topic, and each will speak to that question, and they may want to have a bit of conversation between them. And then at that time, we'll open up for a couple of questions from the audience. Then after that, we'll have to stop the audience. I know there will be lots of questions. Then we'll move to the second topic, and then we'll have questions again. So it will be a bit of back and forth. And the first topic relates to how we marry, in a sense, the economy and the environment. And it picks up on some of the comments that Cleo Pascal made in the question period in the last session, which I wrote down what she said. The Western economic system has failed, and can we fix it? And this links to the questions that I had given the panelists, which is around this question of the green economy. And it's widely understood that many of the environmental problems that we face in the world today are really a product of the way the economic system works, right from our individual consumption decisions to national economic policies, right to global economic trends. They all feed into environmental issues. And at the same time, and especially coming in recent years on the heels of the Rio +20 Earth Summit, we've heard about this concept of the green economy. We need to make the economy work for the environment. And this green economy concept is really calling on governments to value resources, to value environmental ecosystem services, and to value the sinks, the carbon sinks, the forests around the world in a way that will work themselves with, if we put monetary values, in other words, on these environmental resources, that they can then be brought into the market system in a way that the market system will work for the environment. Because to this point, we haven't really had serious dollar values put on these kinds of environmental services. And so this idea is that if we can have a green economy, we can, in a sense, have our cake and eat it too. Even at the Poland Climate Summit this week, we heard the chair of the conference say, climate action can be an engine of green growth. So it's a pretty big order, a tall order for us to bring environmental issues fully into the economy and value things properly, but it's also an area that's fraught with debate. It's not always clear how this can actually be done. So that's really the background of the first question that I'd like to ask both panelists is, do you think that a green economy is possible? And perhaps to broaden it, do you think it's desirable to follow in this kind of approach of having a green economy? And if so, can we do it within the current economic framework? And the follow-up to that is really, can we balance economic growth with a pressing need for ecological resilience and social equity? And so I know these are huge questions, but both of you have worked on them for most of your careers, and I'd like to first start with Professor Rees to hear your feedback on this question. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Am I on? I guess so. Thank you very much, Jennifer, for the kind introduction. And it's a delight to be back among my Trudeau fellowship. So it's a real pleasure to see some old friends and some new faces, and I hope we continue to enjoy this discussion. I'd like to begin my remarks with two reflections that have come out of the sessions this morning. The first is that, quite frankly, human beings, because it's technologically possible, have now created a number of overlapping global systems that are simply beyond human comprehension. Complexity science tells us that the scale of a system, as the scale of a system increases, the number of possible first-order interactions increases as 1/2 the square of the number of components. So we've created a global economic system, a global ecological system, a global political system that quite frankly is beyond the capacity of the human mind to cope with and to understand intelligibly, particularly when we recognize that all of these systems are interacting one with another. So that global governance in the sense of maintaining some kind of control over the lot is, in my view, completely impossible. It's not something that we can manage, certainly not in the foreseeable future, in the next couple of decades when I think many of the decisions we need to be taking will have to be taken. The second comment is somewhat related and very much bearing on the last speaker's remarks, and that is that much of our discussion is devoid of a profound understanding of how power politics works, so that almost everything I will say after this becomes irrelevant in a world in which power politics pays very little attention to academic analyses, to real data, and so on and so forth. The power politics is a different game altogether that has to do with the maintenance of national or personal prestige. It operates out of ideological positioning that has almost nothing to do with the factual basis of our existence. And that's just a reality that we have to deal with, and I think confounds much of what we're doing. So in some sense, it isolates the little discussions we have around environment and economy from the kind of reality in which the decisions about these things will go forward. Okay, so that's background. Now I'll answer the basic questions as I understand them. First of all, do I think a green economy is possible within the current economic framework? This is a multi-layered question. And the first thing we have to ask is, what do we mean by a green economy? Certainly, the pricing of nature and the incorporation of natural resources, or what we prefer to call natural capital and natural income, into the current mainstream economic system is doomed to failure. It's simply a way of extending the current market economic system or neoliberal economics into the environment. It commoditizes nature in ways that deny the fundamental properties of complex ecological systems, many of whose functions are transparent. We simply don't know about them before they disappear, for example, and hence it becomes impossible to establish a real price on what these goods and services of nature mean. Environmental economists will claim, for example, that benefit-cost analysis is the most powerful tool in their kit bag. But benefit-cost analysis is utterly dependent on the capacity to identify valuable benefits and costs, to put a price on them in some way, and then to balance these things in a very complex formulation. And the simple fact of the matter is that for many of these transparent functions in nature, we can't identify them, we can't price them, and this completely undermines the technical and theoretical basis of benefit-cost analysis. So theoretically, it's an elegant and intellectually very satisfying tool that is impractical in terms of its application in the real world as we are coming to know it. Now, there's hundreds of examples of this. I just want to leave it at that at this point. The second thing we have to recognize is that the mainstream economy operates from socially constructed models from the 19th century. We've already had a discussion of this earlier this morning. These models were based on elements borrowed from Newtonian analytic mechanics. The environment, the function of ecosystems, biophysical systems such as the climate, are not incorporated in any way into these models of the economy, nor is human behavior in any realistic sense. Human beings are assumed to be individualistic, atomistic, self-interested utility maximizers. There's no sense of community, no sense of family, no sense of social interaction whatsoever as part of these economic models. Now, would you really even want to invite a self-interested utility maximizer to dinner, let alone engage in reasonable discussions about the future of humanity with such an individual? So we are running the world, certainly the Western world, from economic models that are devoid, and I mean this literally, devoid of any important insight from the important macro systems, the biophysical environment, and indeed the social environment with which those economies interact. So why should we be surprised when we screw up to the enormous extent that we have? We have destroyed many ecological functions. We're on the verge of completely upsetting the global climate system. Inequity, one of the major goals of sustainable development for the last 20 years and beyond that, is worsening on a daily basis because of the implications and applications of these models. So in my view, there's absolutely no way from within the present economic modeling approach, the neoliberal market-dominated approach, that we can arrive at a green economy. Now, what do we mean by green? I'll speak a little bit now as an academic scientist, as a systems scientist, based on the best knowledge that we have of how global systems function and operate. If we just look at climate, and I want to emphasize that climate change is merely one symptom of what I call gross human ecological dysfunction. Other symptoms that are just as important include biodiversity loss, the acidification of the oceans, the gross pollution of the oceans, massive soil erosion, which has destroyed at least 20%, some say 30% of the total arable land surface of the planet, and on and on and on. We focus on climate change because it's something, everybody talks about the weather, it's something we can all understand, but it's only one of a multiple complex of symptoms, all related to the same gross human ecological function that comes to a very large degree from the application of ecological, or rather economic models that contain no important insights about the function of the environment. So if we actually look at the science here, what the science tells us, climate science, is that we're 80% over the top. We need to reduce by 80% our use of energy, at least the fossil energy, upon which the entire global economy is currently based, if we hope to avoid catastrophic climate change. Some of you will know that a few months ago, even the World Bank has now conceded that we're headed toward 4 degrees of warming. If all of the current agreements that governments have come to are fully implemented, and I don't suspect we're going to get much out of COP19. Now, 4 degrees of warming, going to the previous discussion, means China no longer exists. It becomes essentially uninhabitable, as does much of India, as does much of Africa, as does much of northern South America, the southern part of the United States, and frankly, a good deal of the habitable world. So this is possible within this century, in other words, within the lives of some people in this room, certainly your children, and it could mean the displacement of some billions of people, perhaps 2 or 3 billion people. This world cannot accommodate any change, obviously, on that scale. This is where geopolitics becomes very important. China will not be able to feed itself. China will try to feed itself by other means. The most obvious means right now, for example, is the phenomenon of land grabbing, by which China and other countries, which are vastly overpopulated relative to their biocapacity, are purchasing under what they refer to as underutilized lands in poor countries and producing food for shipment back home. This is just symptomatic at the national level of global overshoot. Our ecological footprint work shows that only about 6 countries on this planet are capable of self-support, were they insulated from the rest of the world. Every other country is dependent on imports, global trade at the present time to sustain itself. China and India are very much among them. I'm talking about feeding themselves and providing themselves with the products of nature here. Other countries, of course, are dependent on the imports, or rather the dollars they earn from exports. Canada is one of them. Many people think Canada is underpopulated because we have a small population and a huge landscape. But the reality is that our surpluses are taken up by the deficits, the ecological deficits in other countries. We export 1/2 of our agricultural land. 1/2 of our active forest land is exported in the form of wood fiber. 1/2 of our fisheries, a little more, are exported to fill the ecological deficits in other countries. There are no surpluses on this planet. And our most recent work with the Global Footprint Network suggests that, in fact, we're using nature at about 50 to 60% more rapidly than it regenerates itself. In other words, by this year, by August 20th of this year, the world had already consumed more biological assets than the world will produce in the entire year. So we're currently feeding ourselves and otherwise providing a fiber and carbon sink function and so on by depleting the natural capital assets upon which we depend. It's as if you had a bank account and you weren't living on the interest, but rather depleting that capital. Climate change is an example of this. The excess carbon emitted by the economic processes of the planet is a form of waste that is accumulating in the atmosphere because the biosphere is incapable of assimilating the current output of carbon. It must be reduced by about 80% below 1990 levels if we're to avoid that catastrophic climate change. Now, I may be running over time. Stop me at any. I can go on like this for several hours, so let's have. Put the Canadian context, or put Canada's current economic development policy and that of my own province in this context. We have now got a government who is basing our entire economic future essentially on the development of oil, gas, and coal for exports. So this is the exploiting of the world's demand, the continuing demand for fossil fuels. But in many respects, this, to my mind, is a form of moral negligence. If you look at even the Canadian Criminal Code, it defines criminal negligence as doing something that a reasonable person would not do, or failing to do something that a reasonable person would do if it causes death or damage to some other person. So we've now got a very solid scientific evidence of human-induced climate change. We're aware that carbon dioxide emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions from the human system is causing that. And yet we make deliberate decisions to accelerate the process as a matter of economic development priority in this country. To my mind, that is visiting ecological violence upon other people, and we do so willingly now with the excuse that, well, if we don't do it, somebody else will. So it's okay if we take part in mass murder if we're just one of the several perpetrators of the fault. Options are available. We could develop a truly green economy of the kind implied by this question if we were to accept the notion of the steady state economy, which globally would be about 2/3 the size of the present world economy, accompanied by a deliberate program for the redistribution of consumption and therefore wealth to poor people around Earth. This is possible. We can do it. Human beings have 5 qualities essential in solving the problems that we're dealing with. The first is high intelligence, the capacity for logical analysis based on the evidence. Again, put that in the context of what we're doing in this country at the present time. Our policies are not based on the evidence. They're driven by ideology and the opportunistic short-term thinking associated with development of oil and gas assets before they could become stranded. Think about this. If in 5 years we have a sufficient number of major typhoons to wake the world up so that we shift rapidly away from fossil fuels, Canada will be left high and dry with an infrastructure dedicated to the export of resources that nobody wants. They become stranded assets and we have no fallback position. We'd be much better off developing the alternatives that I hope we get into in the discussion. We've chosen not to do so. So not only are we guilty, in my view, of moral negligence, but we're also committing ourselves to a dead-end economic future that nobody can respect in the present and will certainly do us damage in the future. So we could go to a steady state economy if we applied these 5 qualities. Our high intelligence, our capacity for logical analysis based on the data. A second capacity, unique to our species, is the ability to plan ahead. We ought to be looking not to the short term defined by electoral timetables, but rather to the 20, 30, and 40-year future that many of our present young people will be engaged in. Planning ahead is a unique attribute of our species. We have the capacity, and this relates to something I've said already, to make moral judgments, to distinguish right from wrong. Let us exercise that capacity in the global context in terms of our own development policy. We have, as a species, an unparalleled number of ways in which we can cooperate and to solve these problems internationally and even within the country. We have the capacity to be compassionate about the plight of other people and the plights of other species. So these 5 qualities together are all we need to solve these problems, and each of us is capable of every one of them. But what we've done in the last 40 years is politically construct a dialogue that denies all of them. We do not look to the evidence. We do not cooperate. We've built an economic model based on a competitive marketplace interactions without the political overview. We're certainly, in my view, acting immorally in all respects in terms of global food security, sharing the wealth, and so on and so forth. And this has been deliberately constructed. We've had the deliberate construction of a model of development away from the notions of the public good, of community. The reality is that sustainability, the emergence of a green economy, is a collective problem that requires collective solutions. And yet we've denied ourselves the ability, the right to talk about these in terms of our community, in terms of collective interests. Instead, we have a competitive world based on individual short-term self-interest, the future be damned, and that is the nature of the political dialogue, particularly, I have to say, in North America, not nearly so much in Europe. So I guess my bottom line is that no, we cannot see a green economy emerging from the present values dominating in at least the Western world. We cannot see a green economy emerging from neoliberal economic paradigm. It simply doesn't contain an adequate representation of the biophysical or social worlds within which it interacts. And in order to move toward a truly green economy, we need to abandon a failed experiment and implement a new one. And the science is there. I tell you, the science, the description of what a steady-state economy looks like is also there, and we have the intellectual and moral capacities to do it should we choose to do so. But this requires that we make that choice, and at present, we've been denied the political capacity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Wow, that was a very rich, thank you. So much in there, and you've summarized it. But I just want to let people know that a couple of Bill's recent papers have been posted on the Trudeau Foundation website if you want to dig in more and couldn't take notes fast enough, as I found myself in that situation. Okay, I want to pass it on to Art.
Thank you. I agree with a lot, but not everything that Bill says. But what I want to do is start off from a somewhat different point of view. We were talking over dinner last night, and Bill was in a state of despair, which we all are at one time or another. So I was saying, no, you can't be in despair. We have to have hope. And I guess you're saying at the end of your talk, yes, there is hope. The science is there. Wake up, yeah. Wake up, smell the coffee, if that's a green economy thing to say. Then we might be able to move in that direction. I think we are moving in the opposite direction, but I still would go back. I'll play hope if you want to play despair, but equally we could be despairing that the situation is getting worse rather than better. I'm going to start off with the quote, short history of the green economy and where it's come from. And if you go back on this, there's nothing new here. It goes back into the, I'm leaning over in this direction because I realized when I was sitting over here that you people, nobody can, if you're sitting in this seat, you can't see us. We're seeing the back of my head. So anyway, what we're actually doing is taking the ideas that really evolved during the 1970s and into the 80s, which was a big and very, at times, arid set of arguments between the limits to growth people and the cornucopians. The cornucopians were saying there is no problem, that basically, fundamentally, there's lots of resources in the earth, and they point to all sorts of examples. The limits to growth people were, in the minds of some people, proven wrong because we still have oil, we still have aluminum, and we still have this, that, and the other. Then this argument got a little more sophisticated, perhaps at the turn of the century, the current century, and just before, when people started talking about the monetization of ecological services, goods and services, PES it was called, and now there's a lot of work on something called TEEB, which is dealing with biodiversity and ecosystems, so like whole ecosystems, the value of whole ecosystems. And so there's a lot of analytical work has gone into that. A lot of it relates back to the price of carbon and how much is tied up in the Earth's ecological values just in that one thing alone. But it's a very interesting and very useful way of looking at it. So these two terms, green economy and green growth, really came out as a different kind of response. It was a response to crisis, basically, particularly the green growth arguments. They came out after the 2008 meltdown, and there was this kind of determination that we could have a new kind of growth pattern that would not just reinstitute the financial systems and so forth that were there before. The green economy arguments, though, were based, and it's largely come out through work done through United Nations Environment Program, and this is a kind of a follow-up to what I would call the 1990s aspect of the follow-up to the Brundtland Commission report, which was basically saying that the Earth's economy and the Earth's ecology are interlocked. You do something to one and you do it to the other, which is basically what Bill is saying as well, I think, in more detailed terms. But the problem with the green economy concept is that, first of all, it doesn't adequately bring out the social dimension of sustainable development. So we can't just talk about the economy and the ecology. We've got to talk about peoples and the things that Bill was mentioning as well. So I find that the green economy idea, while interesting, is lacking in the interlocking between the three dimensions because the social side is largely left out of it. But the thing that was troubling always to me, particularly when I was president of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, because I was caught up in all the discussions with our board members, with lots of people, and it was basically saying the market really can, leave it to business, leave it to the marketplace, and things will get better. And that was a fundamental assumption really in the Brundtland report as well. And I still see that lurking very strongly in the green economy ideas, and I don't think that's good enough. I don't just that's a mild statement. It won't work, to put it in Bill's words, and so it isn't that we can ignore the market, but we can't just depend on the market, and so some of the phrases though that come out that continue to come out now, but which really irritate me, is it's job stupid. And there's a big, that's what politicians like to say. Don't you get it? It's all about the economy. It's all about jobs. And so some of the people that deal with green economy say, yes, there can be all these new jobs created. Particularly UNEP is very strong on this. If you go to the OECD, who talk about green growth, they're much more cautious about saying anything about jobs. They're not saying that the green economy is going to produce new jobs in any major sort of way. The next thing is, and this goes back to much of the thinking about the marketplace, and that is just get the prices right and the problems disappear. Well, that doesn't work either. And one of the problems, and Bill, I'm surprised you didn't mention it, but is this whole question of subsidies. And this was the fundamental underpinnings of the Brundtland approach. Get the prices right, get rid of perverse subsidies, particularly fossil fuels, which are now estimated to be $500 billion a year in subsidies, fishing subsidies, you name it. And of course it will help. That's movement towards the green economy. But it's not enough. And the next thing would be to just think about sustainable consumption. I mean, I divide the world into sort of three groups. There's the rich, us, those of us in the world, wherever they might be located, a developing country or a country like Canada, that have the money, and we start substituting what we think are important things to us, but as my wife, who is a non-materialist, would say, but those are wants, they're not needs. And so we're far past, for most of us that have money, satisfying our needs. So there's no end to the wants. And that's very troublesome because you can't have a green economy that's just totally based on wants. And largely that's what we're faced with in countries like the United States, Europe, and Canada. On the other hand, we also have this new population that's emerging in countries like the one I'm most familiar with now, because I do most of my work there, is China. So China will have roughly, by one estimate, 800 million people who are going to be middle class with enough disposable income that they are going to be satisfying wants. We don't even know what those wants are. Some of those will be relatively non-material wants, like getting their kids educated. Other things will be luxury automobiles, luxury this, that, and the other, buying 2 or 3 apartments as hedges against not having good pension funds, etc. And so that's going to become very important in the mathematics and calculations of green economy and what people are willing to sacrifice in the way of wants. And then, of course, there are the people who are in very poor circumstances anywhere in the world, whether it's Aboriginal people, as Sean Atleo pointed out last night, or whether it's people in China, in rural areas, or anywhere else in the world, Africa and so forth. And these folks, it's still important to recognize that there is something called green economy that's important to them as well. And that's where things like ecological services and being able to do, as China is doing now, has massive programs of eco-compensation, which are very much green economy, and forcing into the system the recognition that people who are protecting ecological services, watersheds and wetlands and desert, stopping desertification, etc., deserve to be part of a green economy. And so we've got to stretch our minds open very, very carefully and widely as to what goes into green economy. The fundamental problem I have with it, though, and I used to do this when I was a professor at Dalhousie, just assign the students, okay, here's a nice wetland. Somebody wants to build a casino on the shore of the wetland. Who wins? Well, the answer is very simple. Economy trumps the environment. Go to northern British Columbia right now in fracking, and the Premier of China is off in Asia, I believe, right now. Premier of British Columbia is off in Asia and China and elsewhere, I believe, trying to sell that gas. So economy trumps the environment. And I could give dozens of other examples. So in other words, we haven't, as Bill said, taken it seriously enough, and we haven't dealt with the externalities of things like climate change and so forth. So the issue for me, one of the issues, one of many issues, and I'm just going to quickly go through this, so we'll start to have some questions. But one is it reasonable to talk about a steady state economy? If I mentioned a steady state economy in China, I wouldn't be working there very long, I'll tell you that. I'd be thrown out at this point in their history. Is it possible to have a pro-growth approach to green economy? That's what the green growth people would like to believe. I'm not particularly in favor of some of the things that they're saying, but I do think that we could be thinking of and it's taken me a long time to get to this point, and I kind of spit out the words not very comfortably, but a pro-growth economy might coexist with a green economy if we could, in fact, be careful enough in how it was designed. It would mean massive differences in how we use energy, materials, and so forth. And it depends on what we do. You could obviously say things like, well, tourism fits in that and so forth, but let me tell you, tourism is not without its environmental costs as well. The other thing that's critical, and this was, I think, what Jennifer was referring to, is the trade and investment areas. These are so overlooked as an important part of any kind of thinking about green economy. And yet they're absolutely crucial. And one of the things that really troubles me right now, because of all the backpedaling that we're doing in the world on these matters, is that the WTO was starting to build into its genetics some of the underpinnings that are important for green economy. Now, what's happened is, because it's stalled in everything, people are now creating these separate trade and investment agreements. We're trying to sign them. China's signing them all over. Where's environment in that? If you think there's any kind of thing in there that is related in what we've done in NAFTA, for example, as a regional trade agreement. But all these other regional agreements, there's nothing on environment. So it's strictly economics. And we're required, I guess, under Canadian law to do environmental assessments of those things. Well, go and take a look at the environmental assessment of the China-Canada trade stuff. Nothing. It's really nothing. It's fluff. So that's problematic. And just a couple of other things. I think that's going back to the questions. One is that I think that the economics of urban growth represent one of the great opportunities for thinking about green economy. I'll come back to this in the second part. I won't try and make that argument now, but I'd like people to bring up questions on that point. I also think that this, we've got things like the ecological footprint. There's work underway by a fellow named Johan Rockström in Europe who works in Sweden, but he's looked at this issue of planetary boundaries, what you could call red lines, things that you don't want to go over. And we've already exceeded some of those, as Bill can tell you more clearly than I can. But there's other things that he's now looking at with some others that are called social boundaries as well. And so they've got kind of a donut. So you have this, however many, depending on who's talking about it, might be different numbers, but let's say about 11 planetary boundaries and 8 or 10 social boundaries. Things like food supply and water kind of bridges between the two. But things that are important in our social fabric of whether we can continue as civilization, and then those things that are important ecologically as to whether we can continue as a species, perhaps. And so in those, looking at those boundaries, I think that gives us a framework that about what we have to do if we're really serious about talking about green economy. My problem in talking about it in this country is who talks about green economy? Have you heard a politician use the words green economy? Seriously? I mean, and not at the federal level and very little at the provincial level. If you go to Europe, you'll hear lots and lots of discussion about it. And in China, the way it's coming out there is not green economy, but green development. And I think that's a much more sane way of looking at it in relation to the social, economic, and environmental considerations taken jointly. So maybe I'll stop on that note, and let's have some questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Art, for that articulate presentation. Okay, so both panelists have a degree of skepticism, let's say, but maybe different shades of hope about the future.
Shades of green.
Shades of green, exactly. So, and we are running a bit behind, but I would like to say both speakers kind of bled a little bit into the second question, but so we'll have shorter responses next time, but I would like to invite some questions from the audience, and I see there's mics on both sides. What I'd like to do is collect the questions and then come back to the panelists to maybe speed it up since we are running a bit behind, but we will start here.
Okay, excellent. I'll try to keep this really brief. My name is Zoe Todd, 2011 Trudeau Scholar. As an anthropologist, I can't say that I know much about steady-state economies, but I'm wondering if there's space in both of your sort of views to bring a less anthropocentric position to this debate and look to things like Chief Atleo yesterday spoke about the importance of reciprocal and respectful relationships to the environment and to animals. And perhaps maybe part of the problem that you're touching on is that this failed experiment has also been a very arrogant approach to humanity and how we are positioned within the broader sentient environment and the animals that occupy it, and the non-human persons and spiritual sort of powers that also exist in the environment. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take a question over here.
So Joseph Heath, I'm a 2012 Trudeau Fellow. So, and I can't see Bill anymore, but anyhow, I want to ask a question. So I was very struck by the formulation from Bill Rees with respect to cost-benefit analysis, that you thought it was something that is intellectually attractive, but then practically useless. So my experience, particularly in teaching it, is the exact opposite, that when you present it, that no student I've ever met finds it intellectually attractive, because It's very, very messy and so forth. But then what happens is when you start thinking very, very practically about environmental problems, that's when it begins to impose itself. Simply because if you look at the various paths sort of going forward and the various scenarios that are conceivable, there's absolutely no plausible near-term scenario under which environmental values simply trump other values, right? Under all plausible scenarios, they're going to be traded off against other kinds of concerns. And so then the question is, how do you make those trade-offs? And then that's the practical question. And then cost-benefit analysis presents itself as an answer to that. And so what I'm wondering is, if that's not the answer, then what is the answer? So that if a politician comes with a very, very practical question and says, for example, like a dream scenario, a politician says, I want a comprehensive carbon tax, but I'm not sure how high it should be. Should it be $20 per carbon ton? Should it be $50 per carbon ton? And I'm wondering, cost-benefit analysis provides controversial, but at least a framework for answering that question. And I'm wondering what the alternative is to that framework for answering the questions that we're likely to actually encounter, or, even under ideal circumstances, right? The kinds of very practical questions we're likely to encounter.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take a question over here.
David Kahane, Alberta Climate Dialogue. I want to hear the answer to Joe's question. But I also, Professor Rees, you raised power politics, and then both of you offered analyses that are really at some great distance from what seems politically palatable or politically plausible anytime soon enough to deal with climate dynamics, for example. So I just wonder, insofar as you do see a path to less than 4 degrees, what story do you tell yourself, broadly speaking, about how that might come about in the world of power politics?
Okay.
Hello. I'm going to take slight issue with William Rees. In many respects, I totally agree with you, but I think the thing that when we talk about the 3 overlapping circles, the economy does always trump environment, because people forget that economy is 100% environment. The paper money in my wallet, the metal money in my pocket will tell me that came from the environment. But we're only putting a value on some of that. All the externalities have not been kind of commoditized. And surely that would be a much better way to getting a green economy than actually just talking an old economy and putting green bows on it. Welcome your thoughts.
Okay, just 2 more quick questions, and then we'll yeah, are you over? Okay, why don't we go to the panelists then, and you can have some quick responses, and then we'll collect the final.
Go ahead, Bill. Just be short.
Okay, so one of the first questions had to do with the human engagement with other species in cities or elsewhere. We have to face a fundamental reality, that we are one species and part of every major ecosystem on Earth. Human beings, by every measurement that we take ecologically, are the most important herbivorous and carnivorous animal ever to walk the planet. We make Tyrannosaurus rex look like a piker. Now, what I'm saying here is that every product of nature that is converted to human use, whether direct for our consumption or in the construction of our infrastructure, displaces other species. So there is a fundamental thermodynamic and ecological incompatibility between conservation of biodiversity and the continued growth of the human enterprise. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. So the more we take, the less there is available for non-human species. Listen, everyone here is searching for solutions. If you read the history of human civilizations, there are a dozen excellent books now on what seems to be a cycle of rising to some pinnacle of achievement intellectually, artistically, and so on and so forth, followed by precipitous collapse. It's a pattern that seems endemic to the nature of the complex systems that human beings build. Now, I'm not saying we're necessarily on that path, but I am saying that there are some problems that are insoluble. Certainly, I would argue that the way we have currently framed the sustainability issue makes it insoluble. We will not solve this problem with the tools we are currently willing to utilize. As someone over here mentioned, the failure of government and so on and so forth. Politics won't do it. What are the alternatives? Well, that's a very big question. It may be there is no alternative within the way we've currently framed the question. I'll deal with this a little bit more in the next session. Look, we need to put an absolute cap on carbon. It's not a question of pricing it. We know how much carbon should be released to maintain and reestablish atmospheric stability. So if we could come to an international agreement on the total, and in fact we know what the numbers are, the total amount of carbon that can be burned, and absolutely limit to that, and then develop some market mechanism for allocating the residual to nations, I would say on a per capita basis, but that's an equity issue that the US won't tolerate, for example, then we could solve that problem. So it's a question of combining the technical expertise that comes from understanding of the ecosystem's assimilative capacity for carbon with the market system. Put a cap on carbon, limit it to the amount that would enable a reestablishment of global climatic stability, and then market to the world's nations the residual. There are some other questions. I've taken too long already. I'd like to come back and address
well, I think the fundamental point that we have to recognize is that economics is an anthropogenic construction. I mean, we're not talking about the environment as we know it as ecologists. And as long as that's the case, and as long as we're trying to fit our view of the world into the economic view, we're going to be failures in one sense, even though there's lots of room, I believe, for bringing in some ecological matters on a practical basis, both into benefit cost and into other things. I tend to agree with Bill on the benefit cost side, because you can make benefit costs do almost anything you want. Try the sewage system in Victoria, for example, or something else. You can put numbers together, and the same is sometimes true with risk analysis. And we have the hubris to believe ourselves sometimes on these matters, when as ecologists we certainly have to put up big caution signals all the time. We don't know necessarily what creates extinction or what creates changes of state of ecosystems, or a fish stock that declines. So that's one point that I think goes back through most of the questions that have been raised so far. I think the point that's important for me is that there has to be a very, very strong element of the things that Grand Chief Atleo was talking about last night. I do really try and learn from indigenous people, and whether they're, we call them Aboriginal people, First Nations, or whatever, it can also be community-based knowledge, people that have first-hand knowledge of what goes on in a particular circumstance, because you learn things in a different sort of way, and you learn about, there's one way of looking at it is something called the economy of nature, and that's terrifically helpful. But it seems to be very, and so I'm a strong promoter, for example, of co-management. And because you can, and I've seen this in many places, in Indonesia where I used to work, where you'd find things that would almost be textbook examples of what a resource economist would tell you to do. And this is all the evolved knowledge that's been created over hundreds of years or thousands of years, even in some cases, about how to make a system sustainable. And so from that point of view, again, there are, I think the answer to the last question that was posed to us actually was the one about whether or not we could create an alternative green economy. And my quick response on that is there's no one alternative, no one green economy. There's green economies that are appropriate to cities, with people living in cities. They're appropriate to countrysides. They're appropriate to local, small, isolated populations that are totally dependent on resource systems. And so that's one of the strongest messages for me, but it's also a message that gives me hope if we construct from the bottom up in many cases. The bottom up might be for a city of 12 million people like Beijing or Tianjin or Shanghai or Vancouver for a smaller one. But I think we're going to find these many different models that at least have some aspects. And just finally, I'd agree very much with Bill that the fundamental thing is as long as we're not pricing carbon, we've got nothing to go on there. And whether it's called a carbon tax or some other thing, when I was a member of the National Roundtable on Environment and Economy, we looked at 3 water basins in Canada, and we were stunned to find that about 50% or so of the value, crudely put, of the value of those water basins was all tied up in carbon carbon storage. So if you price that appropriately, which we were trying to do by reasonable prices on it, it just changed the whole economics of what you would do in those water basins. And so that's the kind of thinking that we have, but as Bill has said, it's still marginalized in the overall decision process.
Just two quick addendums to what I said a moment ago, and I think building on some of this. First of all, we have to recognize that every economy, whether it's local or regional or national, or whether we talk about communist economies or welfare economies or neoliberal economies, they're all products of the human mind. They are socially constructed based on certain assumptions of those who put those models together. Now, what I said earlier was that our prevailing, the dominant economic system is a 19th century creation that really does not reflect the nature of biophysical reality or social reality on this planet. So it's inadequate. This doesn't mean it's completely useless. There are some elements of it that are, in fact, functional, provided we can get the prices right. So we talk about in Canada being a market economy, but this is mythic. We are hypocrites to the highest degree because we then subvert and undermine the fundamental assumptions that go into the model of competitive equilibrium that makes for a market economy. We subsidize oil and gas. Fisheries collapse because they're subsidized. We enable inefficient fishers to go out there to keep fishing stocks that are on the verge of collapse. This is insanity. So we need to stop subsidizing. It's not permitted in a true market economy. The second thing we need to do, to the extent that we can, is to let prices tell the truth about the costs of using goods and services. If we did that, even admitting that we don't know what all the costs are, the costs that we can identify for the use of fossil fuel would mean that fossil fuel would probably cost $3 to $5 a litre in Canada right now. And if it were priced like that, the economy would transform overnight, well, within a few years. We'd have automobiles that are 2 to 3 times efficient. We'd have huge investment in public transit. Our housing would be much more efficient. The demand for energy would plummet, and much of the climate problem would be solved. So look, we can use economic tools to address these issues, but we do not have the political will to do so. We do not have the public understanding that makes this possible. People don't get it, that taxes in this regard are in their best interests over even the short and medium terms. So when you have an ignorant population and no political will, and a political system that is primarily oriented toward the satisfaction of corporate values, there is no solution to the problems we're here to address.
Thank you. Okay, I see we've got 3 people at the microphones and we've got 20 minutes and we haven't got to the second question. I hate to do this, but are those at the microphone okay if we go to the second and then you can ask, you'll be the first to ask the question? And I'm sure it will relate because both Bill and Art have, in a sense, been addressing the two topics interspersed because it's hard to separate them. But I just want to, in a sense, cut to the chase because you both talked about the models and their problems as well as the kinds of policies that you think need to come into place. And I want to put this in the context of Canada because in this past week, a couple of reports have come out that put Canada towards the bottom. One of them was a European report on carbon emissions where Canada was ranked 55 out of 58 countries on carbon emission reduction, so pretty poor performance there. And another report out of the Centre for Global Development that put Canada 27 out of 27 of the wealthiest countries in terms of its environmental performance. So again, pretty poor performance there. And so the question here that I had given to both of you is what policy changes are needed in Canada specifically to turn this record around, but also what are the biggest political challenges? And especially what Bill just mentioned, the political will. Where are we going to get the political will to address these problems? And so given the time, I want to ask you please to keep your comments brief, and then we'll come right back to the questioners. Thank you.
Environment governance. Yes. Environment governance today. Some of the problems, particularly the political challenges that we see emerging: chill effect, stopping discussion, backpedaling. This is not just Canada, by the way, but Canada is a prime example right now. Race to the bottom. That's how some people are describing the talks in Poland right now. Substitute ideology for knowledge, which is a most dangerous trend, which we've seen, squeezing the scientists to shut their mouth, and in general not wanting to have knowledge, shut down the avenues to knowledge. Addressing problems by crisis intervention rather than the sustainable development approach, which moves towards anticipation of problems, prevention of problems, adaptation issues and approaches. Taking a sectoral versus integrated approach, kill the Department of the Environment, kill fisheries and oceans, habitat, etc. Take a sectoral thing, basically put the regulatory agency within the sector itself, which in theory looks good but often doesn't work. Greenwash, using extensive greenwash in government and in governance. I always think of government as one thing and governance is much broader, because that's the interaction between government and society and between the different elements. And I would include in that the struggle for the terminology. For example, we've seen the emergence when certain other things didn't work in the horrible approach that's been followed on pipelines, so that suddenly now there's a responsible approach, which is being used by the Minister of Natural Resources Canada. And whenever you see that term, you know that that's a greenwash approach, particularly when it emerges suddenly. It's to struggle to take control of the debate and say, we're the good guys, you're the bad guys. And so along with that is the whole bad guy thing. We're the enemy, we're your friends, but there's the enemy out there. And the painting of the environmental community, and even I'd say the First Nations sometimes, into that enemy camp, anybody that disagrees, is a terrible way, going back to the theme of this conference. This is not about democracy. And so what I think one of the important things that has to happen in the next 5 years is it has to become an enabling kind of approach that we follow. Something that brings out public voice, brings out what was said both yesterday and today, brings out the best in what we can accomplish as people individually and collectively. And we're at that point where we need this badly now. Serious damage has been done in terms of environmental governance over the last number of years, and I wouldn't just put it down to this current government. The trend has been there for some time. And the sad part of it, it has both local and international repercussions. When some people do it, everybody in the international looks over each other's shoulder, and that's what's happening now, this massive backpedaling, even on people that know it's against their best interests. You don't want to get caught into trade situations where you're losing your competitiveness. Therefore, start talking against carbon taxes. Australia's doing it, Canada's doing it, so China will do it. China's been wanting to put a carbon tax for the last several years. The Ministry of Finance in China wants it. It won't happen now. So these are the international repercussions that set everything back by years. And by the same token, some of the other things in Canada that habitat protection, for example, by destroying the Fisheries Act in that regard, you suddenly open up the opportunity for provinces to follow suit. And we're seeing it happen now in British Columbia over this last year. Governments say, well, why not? We can get away with it. So there's a certain compact between the people and the government that is important in governance. I feel personally that that's been violated seriously over the last decade vis-a-vis environmental things. And as I say, not just simply with one stripe of government, it's become a trend, and that's very sad. So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us. I think the greatest hopes, one, as soon as you get down to the local level, people are concerned about these issues. There's no question about it. Whether it's in communities, one of the points that was on our list of things is to say, well, is there anything we learn from movements such as Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring? I don't think so from those, but I'd learn a lot from Idle No More. If you go and look at the Idle No More website, for example, and see that comes right directly down to the things we're talking about here, about how to build a sustainable stewardship approach towards the use of resources in the land. And I personally, for the last 2 decades, have learned a huge amount from understanding the approaches that are being taken by the First Nations and the Inuit of Canada. There's a lot for all of us to understand, and where it has been sensibly applied in some of the co-management systems that have been put in place, for example, with the Haida in Haida Gwaii and in the Canadian North, it works, and we come out with something better. But by the same token, the cities are our hope, I think, in dealing with climate change. They have the innovation, they have the resources in the terms of not necessarily the resources. They're starved often with resources for their tax systems and so forth. But overall, there's access to investment and capital in cities that's very important. And above all, you have gifted, trained, interested citizens working there. And so I could go on the international side. China, for example, has just recently developed the idea of ecological civilization, putting leadership at the top responsible and accountable for their actions that deal with environment and development. And I think this is another important part in terms of our needs. One is accountability. Secondly, as we said before, this idea of redlining, appreciation of boundaries, don't step over the edge. Thirdly, integrated approaches to dealing with these matters rather than kind of dealing with each one as a kind of a patchwork. And then in looking at it, creating knowledge-based enabling frameworks so that people have some sense of what is the problem, how do they fit into the possible solutions, and keeping a good and productive dialogue going in terms of trying to deal with it. I'm going to stop. I've got some other things to say, but for time reasons, I'll stop.
Okay, thank you, Art. All right, Bill.
Okay, well, we could be here all day, I suppose. I just want to make, again, a couple of kind of contextual statements before we proceed. Art's suggesting that China and India will grow. Now, obviously, that's happening already, and clearly there's a moral reason for making that kind of assessment. But let's put that in the context of a question that my students get sick of hearing. And whenever they come up with a problem, I always say, well, show me the numbers. Show me the numbers. So I want to give you just a few numbers. The current global ecological dilemma, and that is to say 50% overshoot, where we're using the biophysical output of the planet 50% faster than it can regenerate, and hence by definition, depleting our soils, forests, fisheries, atmosphere, and so on, is caused by current levels of consumption, 80% of which are attributable to the 20% richest people on the planet. In other words, most of the current ecological problem is caused satisfying not the needs, but the wants of the wealthiest 20% of the human family. And every one of us in this room is part of that family. So the arithmetic isn't very complicated. If you want to sustainably raise China and India and the other, couple of billion people living in a state of poverty to Western, that is to say North American, let us say, material standards, we would need, for sustainability, the equivalent of at least 3 additional Earth-like planets. To get to European levels, we'd need 2 additional Earth-like planets. Now, that's simply not going to happen. We don't have those Earth-like planets. So the growth that we're talking about will take place on a single planet that is already overstressed and about to go into major tipping points, what will make life on the planet, certainly civilized life, much less tolerable within the lifetimes of many of us in this room. So we have a conundrum here. We know growth is necessary in the developing world. We know that we're way over the top in the first world in the sense that there's no connection in any advanced high-income country between increasing income and increasing welfare. In fact, in countries like the United States, the relationship is now reversed. The higher the income in the last 40 years, the less happy, the lower ratings of self-satisfaction and well-being are. So here we are striving to maintain ever-increasing incomes in the face of evidence that it provides no social purpose and it's destroying the planet. We've got to, get our heads on straight about this. So what I'm arguing is we cannot have the kind of growth to the level that we're targeting here on the single planet and have sustainability unless the economy completely dematerializes, and that's simply not happening. Last year we saw the highest level of greenhouse gas emissions in history, and there's no indication that that's going to stop anytime soon. So what can we do politically to deal with this situation? Let's turn to Canada. First of all, I've already suggested that our own federal, and in my own case, BC provincial government economic policies are frankly unconscionable in the global context and leave us high and dry in the event that the world finally wakes up. But part of the problem in both cases is our electoral system. The current federal government is supported by fewer than 25% of the Canadian voting age population. Only 60% of us voted in the last election, and only 39% of those who voted for the Conservative Party, and yet because of our first-past-the-post system in a multi-party system, they get to hold all the cards and are doing things against the broader public interest, and in many cases against the obvious poll results. In BC, there's absolute opposition against the pipeline development, and yet it's highly likely it will go forward in our current circumstances. So we need electoral reform if our politics in this country are going to begin to reflect the wider national interest as expressed. We also need to think very carefully about the overall directions in which we are going. Now, I'm going to take a flyer here because I said at the very outset, I don't think we can manage the world in any respectable manner. We pretend we have control over the system. We do not. In the best of all possible worlds, what I would like to see is, frankly, the abolition of the provinces and the recreation of the country around bioregional districts that are urban-centered, but in which each major urban center is surrounded by a sufficient green space to produce most of its own food and fiber resources. Russia had such a plan, as we saw earlier. We need to do this on a bioregional level. And ultimately, this is pure idealism. If this were to grow globally, at the regional level, you have economic scale systems, you have ecological systems, you have social systems that are manageable. We can get our minds around it. We can understand what the local dimensions are. And if we were to able to manage each of these regions in a reasonably sustainable way, the aggregate effect globally would also be sustainability. Trying to manage the world as a whole through trade is catastrophic from an ecological perspective. Think of what trade really does, for example. It enables countries that have vastly exceeded their own domestic carrying capacities to begin to exploit or overexploit the underutilized productivity of nations elsewhere. In effect, we are now doing through a commercial enterprise what we used to do through territorial occupation. It's a kind of colonialism by another term. But the net effect is that where there are remaining stocks of viable natural capital assets, the globalization of the world is drawing down those stocks at an accelerating rate. So first of all, it blinds the people who are over-consuming to the reality of their own overconsumption, because there's no feedback from the system to suggest that they've done so. Meanwhile, it's compromising future development in those areas that are exporting their resources. And many of those exports are invisible. For example, the massive soil erosion in many agricultural regions around the world, including Canada, is actually a product of trade as much as any other factor, because we accelerate the production in these areas to satisfy global markets. But because it's a competitive global market, prices are bid down so much that there's no economic surplus available for farmers to maintain the soils or fishers to maintain the fish stocks and so on. So again, because of the faulty assumptions built into the models of globalization, it becomes a system by which the growing human mass overconsumes all of the other systems upon which we are dependent, depleting them one by one everywhere so that we all hit the limits to growth simultaneously. Climate is the first major global indicator that we're doing that. And I do want to make a comment about limits to growth. That model, many of you are probably too young to know, but in 1972, a book was published with the title Limits to Growth. It forecast that sometime in the middle of this century, we'd see major pollution problems, we'd see population peak and begin to decline, that we might see global civilization collapse because of resource deficiencies. This model was completely trashed. I had a stack of papers 2 feet high on my desk by economists showing how this model was completely irrelevant, that human ingenuity and technological progress eliminated any utility of the concept of carrying capacity to humankind, and so on. So pay no attention to this model. Well, in the last 3 years, both the Dutch government and the Australian government have undertaken studies of the limits to growth model by comparing the outputs of that original 1972 model with 30 or 35 years of subsequent performance by the global economy. And guess what? Frankly, it's stunningly, to me, because it was a very crude model, but the model is dead on track predicting what happened in the subsequent 30 or 35 years. And all the rest of the evidence, from climate change to biodiversity loss to the encroaching food crisis. Listen, people, we are going to have in the next decade a food problem on this planet. Everything the limits to growth model said and was dismissed for saying 40 years ago is unfolding in your lifetimes right now. Just compare the plots of reality against what that model said. My last comment has to do with the Rockstrom study on so-called what was it? Planetary boundaries. Frankly, it's an ecologically ignorant study in many respects. I just have to say this. What we know, just a simple principle from ecology, is called Liebig's law of the minimum. It states that any complex system whose continued function is dependent on a number of critical inputs is limited by that single critical input in least supply. So it doesn't matter that we've only, look, there's 10 planetary boundaries, we've only transgressed 3 of them. All you need to do is transgress one of them if it's a critical boundary, and the whole system comes down. Think about your own bodies. If your brain falls out, you're dead. If your heart falls out, you're dead. If you
but I don't think that's what he's saying. What he's saying is, look, we've already
I'm just saying
a limit on one, and we've got a whole bunch of others we're very close on. So he would probably come back to you and say, yeah, but it could be any one of 3 or 4 that we're getting close.
Rockstrom is also saying this model implies there are no
we better not get into an ecological discussion here.
He's arguing there's no limits to growth implied in this model. Now listen, there are limits to material growth. I'm sorry, that's just a flat-out something you cannot deny in the current context.
Nor would I deny, but I think the important point, I'm not so sure that he is saying there's no limits to growth. Rockstrom, not from what, well, okay, maybe he has, but the discussions I've had with him, I think the point is we're all heading in the same direction, and the direction is there's a fundamental problem on the horizon, and all you got to do is have a grandkid. I got 3 grandkids, for better or for worse, but it's for better right now. But you start worrying about what's the world going to look like in 2100. What's the Aboriginal point of view of the 7th generation, which they take to be that generation that you cannot personally reach out and touch? And that takes you into the future, just beyond the horizon. And that's where I think we have to be looking. Okay. Frankly, I think we're going to get through the next decade. We're going to get through the next couple of decades, but then we're in real trouble. And so we've really only got, in the decision-making role, this next 15 years is incredibly important for us. That's when a lot of the people in this room are going to be doing their most important and significant contributions to the society, all you scholars and so forth particularly. And that's why we're throwing, I guess, the mantle over to you folks. We're saying last night, or at least I was saying, and I think we all agree, that old environmentalists die with their boots on, because the problems are so critical that you just keep pounding away at these things. But what we really need is the folks in this room, the younger folks in this room particularly, picking up the political reins and recognizing that whatever they do, no matter what field they're in or whatever, that they have to take those political reins, whether they do it as a politician or influencing politicians or others, and reform systems, reform the economic systems, reform the social systems, and reform the political systems if we're really going to make it through this longer period, which is the last half of this century.
Just, I have to make two very quick points. I don't disagree with anything Arthur has just said, despite our little dispute over other things that Rockstrom has said outside of that model. It's just that I've heard other people say, well, look, we've only crossed 2 or 3 of these. Listen, these are complex dynamic systems that have lags and thresholds. And the fact that we've already crossed the climate threshold, for example, may mean it's over, in the sense that we may already have passed tipping points, because these are slow, dynamic systems, and we do not know when that tipping point has been crossed with any degree of precision. That was my point. Second thing, we are on, and have been for about 200 years, an exponential growth track in terms of global economic material and energy consumption. With every doubling of the scale of the economy, the total consumption that occurs during that doubling is equivalent to the sum of all the consumption that has occurred in previous doubling periods. So if we manage to double the economy again in the next 40 years, and we're well on track to doing that, and there continues to be a very tight relationship between the scale of economic growth, meaning income in this case, and material throughput, then the amount of consumption in the next 4 decades or so will be the equivalent to all the consumption that has ever occurred in realistic terms. This planet cannot sustain that level of impact. Full stop, period. And that's, I think, what Arthur's really getting at when he said, we may get through the next couple of decades, but after that, it's going to be a different world, absolutely. We can head that off. We have the potential and the capacity, the analytic ability, the ideas to do so. But we need to invigorate the population into understanding the current nature of their dilemma. We have been, unfortunately, particularly in North America, there's been a 40-year campaign by the corporate sector to create what I now call the new age of unreason. It's the endarkenment, a whole array of think tanks designed specifically to disabuse people of understanding climate change, science, evolution, and just about everything that's important. So we've, in effect, dumbed down the population to such a point that there's no political capacity to respond to these crises because people have been convinced they don't exist. This is a horrific situation for democracy, and it's creeping across the border into Canada. I think we're in very dire straits if we follow that path.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. Thanks both for identifying some of the biggest challenges, but also a call for action on what we need to do. I'd like to finally come to those who've been patiently waiting to ask their questions. Please go ahead.
So part of this relates to the last bit, but Desiree McGraw with the Fondation Jean Sauvé, and I'm co-founder of Al Gore's Climate Project in Canada. And as someone who gives presentations regularly to regular Canadians on climate change, I would say 2 things. One, I share your intellectual pessimism, Dr. Rees. I think there's ample ammunition to be deeply pessimistic. But Art, I share your operational optimism because we have a responsibility to be hopeful in our actions. Otherwise, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. What I see when I give these presentations is that Canadians, we have gotten the message across. They understand there's a problem. A recent study by Canada 2020 and Université de Montréal showed that 96% of Canadians surveyed get that climate change is happening, that it is human-induced, and they want to see the federal government play a major role. Where we have failed, people like me, and frankly many of us in this room, have failed is to explain the solutions. They don't understand when they're asked about cap and trade, when they're asked about pricing carbon, they don't get it. There have been politicians who've run on this issue. As you know, in 2008, Stéphane Dion did run on this issue, but again, massive campaign against him. So I agree that we need to look at the politics of the situation. I don't think it's about passing the buck to the next generation. I think we all, in our own enlightened self-interest in this room, are already facing the impacts of climate change, and it's not just about our children and our grandchildren. I think we've been hearing now for 20, 30, 40 years, it's the next generation that's going to figure it out. No, sorry, we've heard that. Let's all do what we need to do. So I think I would recommend that you look at the survey, because what it shows is we can't keep talking about this problem overwhelming people with the real bad news without talking very concretely about the solutions. As I always say, it's about not just changing light bulbs, it's about changing laws and leaders, and we need to talk about democracy, politics, and real solutions. Otherwise, people get overwhelmed and they become apathetic and they disengage.
Thank you. Okay, we'll just hear the we'll hear the last two questions, and I've been passed a note that says we must head up for lunch. So I'm going to suggest that we discuss these questions over lunch, but I want to hear from the last two questioners. Starting over here, please.
Alex Aylett, Trudeau scholar from way back. Déjà vu, kind of. I think these kinds of discussions happen often, sort of at Trudeau events and elsewhere. So I want to push a little bit on practical advice for us, right? We are, I'm talking about the Trudeau community in general, but the scholars in particular, particularly privileged and occupy a particularly interesting position in between politics, academia, and the civil society sector. We understand the issues that have been discussed here. I'm sure that all of us learned something new, but many of us probably have heard this before. What do we do as early career academics and civil society actors and potentially politicians? You look at coverage by Naomi Klein, for example, of the research coming out of the Tyndall Climate Center that is increasingly from climate scientists giving academics the advice to go out and radicalize. You look at Bill McGibbon's campaign saying, you know what, forget about politics. What we need is an economic action campaign based at universities to blacklist investments in petrochemical companies and to begin forcing investment companies to divest themselves of those holdings. If the next 10 or 15 years really are that critical, should we be looking to your careers as models, as productive as they have been, and publish or perish as fast as we can? Or would you tell us to focus our attention elsewhere? And if so, where?
Thank you. Important questions. Okay, final question here.
Yes, thank you very much. I very much agree with what Desiree just said. I just want to respond to your question, Mr. Hanson, regarding North America and the fact that we don't talk about green economy. I think we do, and especially the government of Quebec currently has put a lot of money on the table. The problem is it's mostly going into research and development of new technology, so we still have this vision of green economy that is not re-questioning the dominant paradigm, although more and more people are doing so on the ground and are rebuilding an economy that is much more sustainable. In Quebec, we just had a loi cadre sur l'économie sociale that passed. Of course, it's on social economy, but I think that it shows that important things are going on the ground, and maybe us as a researcher, as academician, as practitioner, we need to reinvest the political sphere and reinvest the democracy if we want to see other change being passed, and not only to do it on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. One sentence each, and then
only one sentence. Oh, gee. Well, they're so interesting. The point. Well, give me two sentences. One sentence to that, and that is, if we had time, we could go into that whole thing that's what I'd call the quiet green economy evolution rather than revolution. It is happening, and it's not just totally underground, it's in corporations and elsewhere. And we're going to see a lot of the fruits of that over the next decade, particularly. And a lot of it's tied up in innovation. The second point, and the one that's really interesting, is how to respond to the scholars and others, not just the scholars, but many people. And I think the fundamental point, which I think Bill and I in our career do periodically probably, you stand in front of the mirror and you ask yourself, what can I do? What is within my bounds? I'm not going to do what Greenpeace does, but I think Greenpeace does lots of good things. On the other hand, you make choices about where you're comfortable, and to be able to get the intellectual base for how you're going to involve yourself in the particular activities. And that, to me, is fundamental. And what I find in the universities, which is the most favored place to be able to evolve that, is people aren't doing enough of it. They seem to be, they're caught up in ways of doing things now that they shouldn't. And that's always been like that. So you've got to be prepared to take risk. You've got to be prepared to stand up for what you really stand for. and to be able to say, okay, if it doesn't work out, I'll do something else, because otherwise you will not get what you won't achieve what you really can achieve. And so think of it always, and this is my view, is to figure out what's going to enable you to be able to do something. And don't think small, think big, because that's what we need at this point in time. And certainly within anybody that has been selected into this rather exclusive group of people, of scholars, you have all the things going for you, including a lot of the enabling circumstances. Just figure out what you can do and then do it, and follow a line that'll make you do it.
Thanks, Art. Okay, really one sentence, Bill.
All right, it's going to be a sentence in 3 parts with colons.
Sounds like a Chinese
There is indeed lots of things going on at the community and popular level. And I often speak to such groups in an effort to encourage their activities, but I always ask that question, show me the numbers. We need a 50% overall reduction in energy and material consumption on the planet. So does your project contribute to an absolute reduction in energy and material throughput? And if it doesn't, it's not really moving us in the direction that we need to go. The second point I'd like to make has to do with the question of the responsibility of the academic community. Most of us scientists are explicitly trained to eschew politics, to stay out of the political arena, because that implies the imposition of our personal values and so on. I think that has to come to an end, because frankly, scientists are still in the best position to interpret the implications of the work that they're doing. But to make matters worse, increasingly, most of our universities, with the collapse of public funding and the idea of a public good, are becoming more and more underpinned by corporate donations, public-private partnerships, which pervert the intellectual and research enterprise toward the reinforcement of corporate values. So it becomes increasingly difficult to encourage my colleagues to engage in the community and even to publish their work freely in the ways that we used to expect. Beware, Canada, your universities are being taken over by the corporate agenda. It's already happened in the US. An example just recently, both Harvard and Clark University, or Brown, can't remember which of those latter two, have rejected the idea that they divest from the fossil fuel industry because they earn huge sums of money in that context. Toronto and UBC are going through the gyrations of this right now. So I have a couple of other things.
You paused, I'm going to stop you. Okay, let's have a round of applause for both presenters. Thank you.